Hello everyone, today we talk about the construction of the Papal territorial domination during the 12th century. We actually never made yet, which is odd, a video talking about the origins of the Papal temporal power during the early Middle Ages and the construction of the Patrimonium Sancti Petri. However, the 12th century is a crucial moment for the definition of the papal signory, not just over Rome, which was rather problematic, but exactly also in its surroundings, and therefore the strengthening of this broader domination in central Italy. And this had not begun yet systematically, right? Especially through the new means that feudalism provided also the Italian lands with, and that in a sense the Pope, as we will see now, took over some prerogatives essentially as a lord, right, as a senior. Had it been a secular power, it would have been using the same means fundamentally, and that is one aspect. But as we just said, the main problem was the city of Rome itself. Also about this topic, we have never made quite a punctual video on it, because we tend to associate naturally the Papal States and Rome with the Papal government to core, but we forget the fact that Rome existed as a free commune, essentially, like the rest of central northern Italy, albeit surely on Papal territory, which was a thing. I was explaining actually this in one question and answer video that was posted recently about the rather complicated juridical and political reality of what should pertain. In fact, the whole investiture controversy was based on, that is, how much is owed properly to the temporal government of the church, also territorially, and the struggles with the empire. So as you understand, Rome did not have much chances, nor actually much interest, by a certain degree at least, to escape papal power in a way or another. Rome surely owed in the centuries to the papal presence much of its fortune as the continuator of great universal legacy, as was covered in churches, in palaces. The Curial and its cardinals contributed heavily to this great output that was really embodied, especially in these centuries, from the 11th, the 12th, the 13th century, by art, by architecture, by painters, by mosaicists, etc., that can still be seen in Rome. And if you visit the city, in fact, you realize that aside from the obvious centrality both of the classical and the Renaissance profile, that surely has fundamentally cancelled what was the medieval city, which existed as an entirely different thing. Of course, enough fortunately has remained also from that time in the impressively radical process of stratification, even just archaeologically speaking. It's all yet all to be studied and researched. When asked them every time they want to build anything underground, how they have to stop at every single meter because they find the next Roman palace, the next, and the catacombs, and so it's really a world yet to be studied. Not much because of the lack of studies that exist, fortunately, on this, but from the material, concrete point of view of how the city was properly built, which renders also complicated technically its research by a certain degree. And this aspect is overlooked because Rome, first of all, had a commune on its own. So it literally had a form of autonomous government, not different, again, from the other communal polities that, however, yes, especially from the end of the 12th century, did suffer of the papal signory in ways that surely choked that kind of popular movement that elsewhere brought to different changes. The Pope was, in a sense, a lord like any other, or almost, let's say. But in these high medieval centuries, the city was actually a pretty big thing. By medieval standards, Rome had been, up to the 11th century, definitely the largest city in Western Europe. It had remained central in all its kind of universal meaning all over the continent, and as you know, had carried out quite a massive amount of international policies that were not just extremely successful, but also durable, to the point that the Roman Church was out there to rule fundamentally, and this had always conferred the city an international character that was obvious for the same presence of the papacy. And in a moment of great economic and demographic growth, like the High Middle Ages were, same city now was expanding in ways that would make it ever more turbulent politically and socially. And this was a typical character of Romanity that remains also in kind of the contemporary stereotype of the Romans being unruly and rough, etc. There are these, thugs, models that allegedly date back to the Roman centurion type and all these things. Rome had quite of course, this is a bit of a mythology, but indeed, when you look at what also medieval cities were in terms of paramilitary, were not openly military traditions, etc., you realize that were quite fierce things. Like the other day, we were just talking about the Italian communes, the level of militarization, etc., and Rome made no exception. It was, first of all, huge. Historically speaking, I mean, Rome is still today the city with the largest historical center in the world, meaning that what the imperial capital had been fundamentally still, was much reduced in terms of inhabitants, etc. But the infrastructures, even just the material wealth, had allowed the city to maintain this quite, bulky profile that was heavily fortified. And this was the main feature, let's say, of most medieval cities in general. But as you know, in Italy, this reached peaks that are not really seen elsewhere. And the thing went on developing further, where from one side, the people that had some primitive forms of associations compared to other Italian communes, exactly because the papacy had kind of stamped them, in part, were also not well documented about them. But we know they had their own military associations. Every quarter fundamentally had its own representatives, its own militia, etc. The barons that were instead this the nobility, that in part was Roman, but as we will see in this phase, and exactly because of the papal expansion outside the city, came to be expressly and by papal will external, right? And so connecting the city further with the Italian interland, and it was fundamentally never really controlled at this point, even by the papacy. The popes had their own guards, their own retinues. They did have some order and control, part of this fortifications and arsenals and everything. But let's say the people and the nobility were at this point not under the full papal control. And naturally, this nobility was quite, first of all, it was quite warlike. This is something we have seen as a specifically papal thing. I mean, in the sense probably of the central Italian nobility that retains some kind of more feudal character compared to the one of the rest of the communal area, and that produced some of the finest condottieri in the later medieval centuries, and arguably actually owned the largest military force in the peninsula, had the Papal States been an actual unitary power, compacted through the statal standards of other Italian signories, it would have probably and likely, and this seems strange because in fact it was backwards enough political institutionally not to achieve that, but take over the entire peninsula. And the Roman nobility had this fame of, in fact, great sense of themselves, of arrogance, of violence, and it would keep this reputation up throughout the centuries. The Roman baronial family were in constant clash against each other. When the people got triggered, they could carry out some of the greatest devastations you can imagine, as always, the people being the most radically violent element of all the community. Also senselessly so, unfortunately enough, but say in the Middle Ages, people had, generally speaking, a much clearer idea of reality than today. And this situation had, of course, the nobility had traditionally participated to the same papal election, so they were the same people that elected, the Pope from within their families, and the other clans would be opposed, and so hence the attrition, etc. But Rome was also at the center of the international scene. So all think about the Germanic expeditions. At some point, Rome was sacked by the Normans that had come to help it actually against Henry IV. I mean, it was a really troubled city that always maintained this kind of level of agitation, and also probably what derives also the degree in which they remained in arms in a way. So it was very difficult actually to control such a big center and such a loaded one in forces of different kind, even for the papacy, that in this regard thought better generally to consolidate its external dominions in order also to secure a greater grip on the city. You know that fundamentally the official reason why Frederick Barbarossa descended in Italy in 1154 was that the Roman commune, had overthrown the Pope. And this had actually happened. They had founded literally a free commune, having expelled the papacy. And the thing was put together, back together. But generally speaking, in the 12th century, you have the bitterest attritions between the papacy in Rome, which is interesting because this is not yet the time in which the nobility was starting to be curbed, as we've seen yesterday, by the people in the rest of the Italian communes. So the city was particular, and unfortunately we don't know enough, right, like in the others. Eventually, exactly because this popular force was stamped in a way, but also which was evidently extraordinary, but as extraordinary was the papal signory per se. So the popes didn't even have much of a choice sometimes, because considering the general political and ecclesiastical situations, popes were obliged during the course of the 12th century to go away from Rome physically. And this distance widened the Curial relations, favoring a certain internationalization of the papacy at the same time. Because up to that point, from the early Middle Ages onwards, the papacy, as we've seen, had always remained connected to the old Roman oligarchy. Very old families, by the way, some of which really had interesting origins pretty far back in time. And this change was crucial in the definition of papal power, because it essentially brought with itself new connections with families that were growing in wealth and power through the same cooperation with the papal court. Bear in mind that the 12th century is also the century of the papal victory over the empire, as far as the investitures were concerned. That, as you know, with the Concordat of Worms, the thing was split in between Italy and Germany, and this provided the papacy with larger autonomy, but it was also the great century of the heresies, in which literally the papacy had to start building a proper state on its own, right? A proper signory on its own. Some bureaucracy, administrative offices that already existed, right? This by some scale within Rome, but that now were required by a much larger degree, that could make the papacy allowed not just to compete with other powers politically on the international, say, moral scene, but also to have a broader control over the whole Western Christendom in a much more consistent way, and stem and cooperating naturally with all the various international elites to stem also, in fact, the radical movements, other instances, and so on. So it was a very dramatic and complicated time. Like, these popes were really relentless in their effort to consolidate what they were seeing. Right? And you can observe it just through the construction of canon law. We've made videos about this also from a juridical point of view. The importance of a modernization, of a scientific approach, of a properly, also a rational approach that by the 13th century especially would give birth to the scholastics, etc. So an important change properly in Western culture that the popes were pioneering in parallel to the lay elites. And in these new relations, the popes formed a new Roman aristocracy, in part fueled by the insertion of latial seigneurial families, so noblemen from the Lazio region around Rome, that starting from the mid-12th century, where you see the big crack with the Roman commune that was eventually tamed again, provided counselors, ministers, functionaries of the Pope that in the 13th century would hegemonize the Curial milieu, right? So an external, mostly feudal elite, in fact, that gradually entered Rome next to the old nobility and eventually took over thanks to the connections that it had built with the papacy. And with Gregory VII, 1073-1085, so the beginner, in fact, of the reforms that bear his name, the life of the papal court took an ever more itinerant character. Also because of the threat posed by the investiture controversy. As you know, Saint Gregory died in exile. It was a pretty military background to this, where the papacy had to, also safeguard literally the curia as people, and then the Pope himself. And the main deal was essentially at the beginning of the good season, the Pope moving with a thick group of his collaborators towards the healthy glacial highlands. First of all, using mobile preparations and eventually permanent residences. So consider that Rome in summer is a really pretty unhealthy place because it's very humid, it's hot fundamentally, and therefore you can imagine in a medieval city with high endemic concentration the incidence of malaria epidemics that in fact struck historically also some famous characters in Roman history, and that this was also for the armies that came there. Very often it was a logistical disaster because, again, mostly hostile, fortified community with a terrible environment, etc. Many epidemics broke in these armies as well, and this would allow also the popes to stay secure from riots and these things when they happen. In fact, if you look at the permanent residences that the popes built, these were like in the guise of palaces, not much just because of the grandeur of the papacy, or the reformed papacy, and what this embodied internationally at that point as a universal power, but also properly for military purpose. These were massive palaces built in stone, right? Huge structures. Eugene III, 1145-1153, erected a summer residence in Segni, starting a series of secondary abodes in Ferentino, Veroli, Alatri, Anagni, Rieti. These are all towns in the surrounding of Rome, where, of course, the popes had already exercised some important influence. If anything, also properly from the city base, right? Rome was not abandoned. The Roman base power of the papacy was maintained, of course. But these were, in a sense, also consolidated as areas that, could control Rome in turn, and not just the other way around. And so they also intermittently carried out a curial function. That is to say, the papal court and its offices and so on were transferred there, right? Were mobile. And as you know, also, other even royal or even imperial courts in Europe were itinerant most of the time. So it was normal, but it was a clever way, as we'll see now, to recompose the territorial domination in a territory that was part, historically, nominally, of the patrimonium, but that the popes had not had much of a firm grip as they would have liked up to that point. So this worked, as you understand, as we've seen before, with a great cooptation of the local elites. In turn, it would contribute also to the construction of these palaces, would get something in return, right? So the typically clientelary business pre-Aristotle times. So the papal interests stretched, therefore, across all Lazio, and these shifts contributed to multiply the papal direct interventions in the local affairs and to realize the first rather steady forms of political coordination of the apostolic patrimonial territory. The papacy, in similar ways to the communes of central northern Italy, was building a proper territorial domination, a concrete base of its independence and initiative capacity. And unfortunately, we do not have quantitative data for these times, because still the areas were, as we've seen, not as developed in the north. Historically, Rome had somewhat swallowed most of the resources from the countryside, so there weren't really other big cities next to Rome, right? The lower Tiber Valley area, the Lazio area, were fundamentally all gravitating around Rome as the bigger center. So we don't have this deep pre-existing level of bureaucratic and administrative development that could properly document this transition. But we understand that it's likely that the Apostolic See, since at least already the end of the 12th century, had drawn great part of its financial resources from the profits deriving in Lazio from the patrimonial revenues and from the exercise of seigneurial power. Besides, from the recognitive, let's go in this way, annual census, and from the periodical renovatio right that were contemplated by the beneficiary Vassalatic relations. So from this you understand that, of course, the Roman hinterland was, as we've seen, rather kind of feudal in nature, at least had worked with this great, private possessions from the most important families. Many of the Roman noblemen actually owned, of course, lands around the city. The popes went also far beyond this in a way, and so in realities that were habituated to some form of seigneurial rule locally, the local magnates, etc., that were standing formally, historically, on the lands of St. Peter. So that historically had brought so many problems also in the most frontier areas in the north with the empire, etc. But that close to Rome were easier to bring under papal control. And this would happen simply by saying, yes, there was, as you know, in medieval law, there was some customary law that had taken form feudally in these lands. Somebody paid to something to the Lord in terms of protection. It was kind of hush money, all these things. And nominally, however, the Pope said, but this land is mine. So surely they would maintain in power many of the local elites that, as we've seen, were actually co-opted within the same papal government. But they would exact essentially those revenues from the same seigneurial rights that the Roman Church embodied as owner of all the land. This was, historically speaking, that basically all the demanial lands that had formerly belonged to the Roman state historically since imperial times in Rome, ever since the popes were fundamentally the only political power formally recognized as such with the dissolution of Byzantine garrisons in the 6th, 7th century. They could claim properly even actually a greater form of sovereignty, because they were properly absolute. Like, every piece of land belonged to the church. And the Pope also made an awful lot of money historically during the early Middle Ages just by letting the city develop autonomously with lucrative business and all these things. But at some point saying, yes, but always remember that you have the permission to occupy my land, which is basically the entirety of the land. But in this sense, remember that I'm still the owner. So if one day, theoretically, you want to throw you out and cash everything, I can't do it. Of course, they wouldn't do it on a regular basis, because they had interests with the same people that worked there. And so, there were more civilized ways to operate. But in theory and also in practice of politics and also of ideology and etc., they were properly the leaders, the bosses, and the lords. So everything that in the Latial countryside pertained to these essentially periodical tributes that were owed to the local lords, and also the money that were paid every time the beneficiary vassalatic contracts were reconfirmed, which had a deadline, right? The emphithausis was the older practice that the popes had. There were contracts that lasted 99 years. So you can imagine, over multiple generations properly, it was easy to sign them, because the person needed the land at the time, and they knew that their descendants at some point in 1 century would have to answer of that. But they say, okay, in my lifetime, anyhow, I'm gonna have that. So, and this could be done by the popes, because of course the land was entirely there, so they would lose actually a very few letting that happen, because it would happen anyway, autonomously speaking, but they would have that under contract, by the way. So a very clever way of administering their possessions that began to extend also to these areas that had remained less regulated, and where therefore also some seigneuries had developed on their own with some hierarchy, etc., that the popes would essentially start to control their own way. And this geographically takes, in fact, the dimension of the whole province of Lazio fundamentally, and it wouldn't go that more far, for example, in the Apennine heartland, because that is that was, first of all, there was some communal government there, or some cities that were developing importantly. Those would be recovered later historically, and also not easily. But the Tiber Valley, these other towns around Rome that were important cities, also of Roman origin, they had their own infrastructure, were well connected to the Mediterranean, right? There were important trade connections also with the Iranian islands. Most of the area was about chattel farming, right? There was a great business in Rome the bobacteri properly with the the cows. Also, fishing was important. The salt mines, of things like this was mostly the Roman economy, and naturally also in the city was a lot of artisans and something more tertiary in nature, and also a big deal again of international exchanges. Just think about pilgrimage coming from all over Europe, etc. So this is practically the picture in itself. These residences built by popes would be the base naturally for some grip eventually on the towns when they began to develop kind of their own communal autonomies, and they had already done by a certain degree at this time. And in fact, Rome would use this later on when the popes still fundamentally consolidated their power from the city to operate properly a territorial control from the city over the centers. The Roman army at some point waged some military operations to curb this and that town that didn't want to cooperate, let's put it in this way. Viterbo in the north of Rome, close to Tuscany, also was an important city that at some point would grow as populous as Rome, but 30,000 inhabitants by the 14th century. But the popes managed to curb that too and to build their own palace there as well. So the palace, as you know, in the Roman tradition, was the bulky, perennial, crystal-like emblem of universal power per se, right? So whoever would imitate Rome, starting from Charlemagne with Aachen, etc., was building this massive stone infrastructures that, as we've seen, were not just for aesthetical reason built like that, but also with a military occupational purpose. These were true seigneuries in arms, right, that waged their power quite ruthlessly. And hopefully we will talk more about medieval Rome soon, because it's a very important and overlooked topic. For today, however, we stop here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.